What's up, everyone? I'm Saber. If you're unfamiliar with me, I am one of the main content creators for the Project M community. I also run PM Rank, which is the annual top 50 rankings that you see every year for the top Project M players. And today we're going to talk about why rankings are important and how to make them. For starters, let's talk about why they're important. Um, in general, we don't play Smash, any game, but especially Project M, because we think it's profitable. We do it because we like the game and we get recognition and pride out of being good at it. Rankings are the way that most people find that recognition. If you're good at the game, you place well, you get ranked, and that's kind of the way you quantify success in Smash, especially in Project M. If you're not in Smash, or if you're trying to grow Smash, one of the easiest ways to do that is to have content exist. There are two main ways to have people talk about your game and to have your game grow. One of them is to run tournaments, something that is starting up again, but which we've been sorely lacking throughout COVID. And the other is to make content. That content can be rankings, it can be combo videos, it can be tutorials, it could be anything else. But if you create content or run tournaments, you are going to have people talk about your game. Talking about the game is how more people get their eyes on it, and as a result, it's how the game and the scene grow. So, making these types of content is important. Not only for the people in the scene who are competing largely for recognition rather than prize money, but also because it creates discussion about the game and brings more people in. So that's kind of why rankings are important and why they're worth doing, both at a national and international level with something like PM Rank, but also why your local scene should have a PR. So throughout this video, I'm going to do two more of these, focusing on how to make tutorials and how to make combo videos. I'm basically going to go through each of these bullet points that are on this outline. I'm going to talk about them and use a couple of examples, and then I'll answer chat questions and comments. And then this will all go on YouTube with timestamps so that you can just get to the bullet points and not necessarily me screwing around the chat. That being said, let's get right into it. Yeah, no, that's exactly why I said what I just said, Cameron, is I don't I'm gonna answer chat questions, but I'm sure a lot of chat is going to be people bitching about their local PRs and or decisions they've made for PM rank. Okay. So the first thing you need to do in order to make a ranking is figure out what you're ranking, which is define your viable results. Are you trying to make a ranking for your local scene? Are you trying to make a PM rank type thing for the entire community? I made a 3.6 rank that was 4 years of data for the entirety of Project M 3.6. Like, what are you looking at, basically? Most of the time, this will be pretty self-explanatory. If you're part of your local scene's PR panel, then you're looking at events for your region. And so then you want to talk about which events count. For example, a lot of regions will choose not to count Arcadians. Arcadians are events where the current PR players are usually banned, which means that if you're a non-PR person who is likely to make PR the next season, all you can do at an Arcadian is fail. At best, you beat people that won't matter to make PR. At worst, you lose to players who are not already PR and it looks bad for you. As a result, a lot of regions will choose to not count Arcadians for PR so that people don't get stressed out or like dodge Arcadians. On the other side of things, you might have, for example, a PM rank type of ranking where you're trying to rank the best players in the world, and as a result, you stop caring about small events. You don't care how Thunder's Rain or Malachi are doing at their locals. You care how they're doing at the majors every year. So for PM rank, we start cutting people off because there aren't enough top players at each event, or the event doesn't have enough attendees, or some other criteria depending on what you go with. For a bigger like I said, for a bigger type of ranking, you're going to see people mostly focusing on requiring a certain number of attendees and or a certain number of people who are on the current or former top 50 rankings. It depends each year on how many events we have, what we actually cut it at, but that's generally what we do for PM rank. For your local regions, you're going to look at primarily how many people on the current PR are there. For the same reason as an Arcadian, you don't really want to be looking at PR data that includes events with only one PR contender in attendance. Because again, at best, if there's only one potential candidate for PR in attendance, at best they're beating people they should be beating and that you don't care about. At worst, they're getting bad losses that shouldn't really be held against them when they have nothing to gain. So you want to find that balance of finding events that are relevant. Another thing that local PR panelists tend to deal with is figuring out how much, if at all, you care about out of region events. Especially for top level regions, like for example, I run the SoCal PR panel. We have players that travel out of region and pick up top 50 wins at other regionals and national level events, and we need to incorporate that into our rankings or not. And so that's a decision that you need to have with your scene and the other people who help make your PR about how much, if at all, you want to incorporate that data in addition to the results that you have at a local level. A lot of the time, the way that that ends up playing out is you care mostly about the local data, but you can use out of region performance as a tiebreaker, or it could be much more significant than that. For example, Thunders never has to worry about not being ranked number one in NorCal, even in seasons where other players like Borgman back in the day or the Doctor have had decent records against him because he's dominant out of region. He's never not the highest placing NorCal player at big events, like in SoCal or on the East Coast or Smash and Splash or what have you, so he doesn't really have to care how he does it locals. He's always going to be number one because of those national results. And so the way you deal with those out of region events is really up to you. It depends on your region and how often people travel. But it's the other component of data that you might need to worry about is you've got your locals, and then you also have these out of region events where it's one of your players against a bunch of people that otherwise aren't in your data. You won't know how your entire PR does against X random player that Teals went out of region and fought, because those other people from SoCal who are being ranked with Teals haven't fought that player. They didn't go to that major. They didn't fight him. So it's you just kind of have to work with that depending on how valuable you think it is and what you think is worth including. So that's the first part. We've defined what results we care about, hopefully. We've decided these are the events that we care about because they have, let's say, a minimum of 2 current PR contenders, which could be either current PR players or people that have just had a strong enough season you think it's reasonable to count them as PR contenders off the bat. They might just have a lot of people at them. They might include out of region events that your region's players have come out to and that they've performed well or poorly at, and you want to consider that in your ranking. The next step, which is not fun, is taking all that data and putting it into something useful. It's one thing to have a list of events that have people that attended them, and it's very different to actually put that into a format that you can do something with. So let's take a glance at how over various years I've quantified event data. For starters, we can look at PM Rank 2016. Okay, I'm going to move this over. There we go. So this is PM Rank 2016's official data. On this tab, you can see we have a list of every major event in 2016. This is the event, when it took place, how many people there were, what region, how we classified it based on how many top players were there. So if it had a lot of attendees and a lot of top players, it would be a super major, major, regional, and then we usually don't care beyond regional. And then we literally typed out by hand, these are all the top players that went to this event. This is great, but this tells me nothing about how good any of these players that I'm listing are. We just know they were there. The real data is here. And what this is a handmade head-to-head chart of the PM Rank 2016 Top 50, where I went through every one of these brackets individually, and I looked at how did Thunders. I went through one event at a time, and I said Thunders played Lunchables twice, or once at the Big Balk, and I typed in -1, and I put a +1 for Lunchables, and then I adjusted accordingly. You can see in the notes for all of the post events, and then you eventually get the record, which is Thunders was up 1 set at the end of 2016. And then you do that for every single player, and that gives you, not only does it give you a average of how they do against all of the other players in the top 50 that they've played. So you can see, for example, the people who tend to be green are up at the top because they tend to win. But Thunders, Lunchables, Sosa, etc. And down at the bottom, you have a lot more red and then yellow, which is even. So you have the people who tend to do worse against other top 50 players, which makes sense. But you can also see how people did individually. You can see, if you care a lot about how people did against other top players, you can see that Lunchables lost to Thunders more often than he won, but he was more likely to beat Sosa and Malachi and Junebug. He had a slightly negative record against Mr. Elf, but beat Gallo, he beat Jose. one lost to Flip, and then a bunch of people he didn't play. But overall, was very positive against the top 20. But so doing this gives you a direct representation of how everyone does against everyone else that we've deemed relevant. Doing this, though, has a couple flaws. One, it's just a lot to look at. It means that you need to go in and type this all in manually, and then you need to go and look at basically, 50 results for every single player mirrored on the other side, and there's just a lot of information to look at and take in, and it doesn't even take into account the people who aren't top 50. So, for example, if someone on this list lost to someone who's not top 50, that doesn't show up anywhere. They're not punished at all for that. And whether or not they should be is up to you, but at the very least, data that should be considered. So for 2017, we got a little bit fancy. Now we have a database of events that were, I don't know where they went. I think I maybe hid that tab. Similar deal, we listed a bunch of events, and then we created an Excel doc where you could go in and you could pick a player, let's say Fuzz, and you could see all of their results against all of the other players listed alphabetically. So you can see here, you get a much more complete picture of how they did. You've got, he beats Blank, he beats Boiling Man, beats Birdman, he basically beats almost everyone, loses to DVD because DVD is very, very good at the matchup. And so again, we found a way to kind of quantify those results. We put them in a format that makes sense. You want to know how a player did, you type them in, you pull up Bacon Pancakes, and you can look at how Bacon Pancakes did. If you want to look at how Bacon Pancakes did against only PM rank players, or PM rank nominees, I should say, you could go to this tab. Doing this is also not easy and kind of a massive pain. These are both methods that involve a lot of manual work. You need to either be willing to put in a ton of hours to do this method, or you need to really understand how to use Excel or Google Sheets for this method. The easier way to do it is do something called Bracket. Bracket.com, this is the PMRank 2019 version that we used. You basically can just upload a bunch of data, and it will put it in there for you. So now, it has an ELO system, which sucks, but you can also just type in a player. It says every player that entered a major in 2019. I can pull up, for example, Pineapple Tommy, and I can see this is the event he attended, this is how he did, this is how he placed, and he only has one event, so it's pretty straightforward. But it's a great way to very easily and quickly identify people's results in a way that makes sense and allows you to pull things up individually. You could also type in, if you want to see how he did against someone, you could type in and find out if he had played them. In this case, he's only played 3 people, so you only get results for 3 people. So that's the gist of it. That's basically how you put your data together. A lot of regions like to do, let me pull up, somewhere in here I have, let me find the SoCal sheet. Because SoCal is a great example of the PMRank 2016 format, but done in a much more manageable way, which, given that you're going to be mostly dealing with local PRs, if you're watching this, it's not that big of a deal to do it locally. So this is the spring 2019 data for SoCal's PR. You can see that I did the same thing that I did for PMRank 2016, but now there's not that many players, so it's not that big of a deal to go in and write down these are the tournaments, these are who attended. You can see here we basically just, I ran a count, these are how many locals everyone attended, and then I put in, these are how they performed against the other people who were on the sheet. Bracket, chat made a great point, which is you can also use Bracket to split up among multiple seasons, whether you make different leagues. This is the PMRank 2019 league, or you can just set it to only show data for a certain amount of time, but continue to use the same league so that you have all the data in one place. Bracket's actually a really useful website that I've seen a lot of people start using. Definitely recommend it to not have to do everything manually. So it's super useful. Okay, so now we've put data into something, whether it's Excel, Google Sheets, Bracket, whatever it is, you have your data somewhere to look at. So what's next? The next thing you do is you actually start looking at it and you try to figure out, like, who could plausibly get ranked on this. For a national level PR, like PMRank, that's a nightmare. It basically means you're setting some kind of criteria for players who have attended multiple events and placed, let's call it, within a certain level. That might mean that they've made top 32 at a major, at something we consider to be a major. It might mean top 64, depending on kind of where we set the cutoff. and they need to have attended enough events for us to consider them as active. If we look at a local example, let's take that SoCal PR again. So here you can see we had a bunch of players who, well, actually, let's start with this step. We have a bunch of these players. We have 11 players here who we said could have been considered for PR. They're on here because one of two reasons. They were either formally ranked in SoCal and they went to at least one event, or they went to events and they beat someone who is considered a PR contender by virtue of having been on a PR before. So, for example, all of these guys had been on a PR before. These two had as well, and then these three, Severe, Frequency, and NA, had beaten people who were on the PR. They had beaten, in their various cases, Severe beat Frequency and Dumb Shiny, Frequency had beaten Fracture, and then NA had beaten Tauntaun and Frequency, who was another PR contender. So that's what gets them on here. They don't have to have been ranked before because obviously people improve and they become PR contenders where they weren't before, but that generally happens because they were beating other people who had formerly or currently been ranked. Then, in addition to having actually been ranked or beaten people who were, you need to be active enough for us to be able to evaluate your skill level. If you go to one event and win it, that doesn't mean you're going to get ranked because we don't have any data to work with. We just know you did well once. So most rankings have an attendance requirement. The best way to do that is to evaluate what's a reasonable attendance requirement based on the season you're working with. Oops, I didn't click back. This is the data I was looking at. So these are the three players. You can see that these are the three Severe, Frequency, and NA that weren't considered PR in previous seasons. But you can see they all have wins over various solid players who were former PR or PR contenders, which is what gets them on this show. But on top of that, they also need to be considered active. So in this case, the SoCal Spring PR season for 2019 was 4 months long. We had events every other week, and so based on that, we knew that we had 2 events per month in 4 months. So we had 8 events in Orange County plus weeklies in San Diego. So there were a lot of events for people to attend. Based on that, we set a requirement looking at how many events these people went to. We counted these are how many events you went to in and out of region. And we set a requirement that you had to go to at least 3 events over 4 months. So a little bit less than 1 per month. It allowed people flexibility. If they hadn't been playing for half the season and then came back, they could still make PR. But it also meant that if you went to 1 or 2 events, you couldn't make PR just by showing up for 1 or 2 weekends. We felt that was kind of a fair middle balance. For something like PM rank, where we're evaluating an entire year, we generally require 4 or more events to be attended because you have an entire year, even though you do have to travel or make it plans to attend bigger events. That's the other half of the activity requirement, is they don't just need to have beaten people, they also need to be considered active. So you can see here we had a big list of people who were PR level, meaning either that they were ranked or that they had picked up wins over people who were, and who had attended at least 1 event. Then we cut down the number of people who hadn't gone to enough events. That was El Shrumo and Teals, as well as Loyal and Swift. And we left the remaining people, which were all the people highlighted green, and those are the people that you see on this tab. You can see over here, so vertically, we only listed people who are considered PR contenders still. That means they beat people and they were active. But we also compare them to people who weren't active. So we also compare their results against Swift, Loyal, Oshrumo, and Teals, because those are still good players, and wins or losses to them shouldn't be discounted when we consider the PR. It's also been pointed, and I should clarify, this is not how everyone does it, this is just how SoCal does it. The Washington PR, for example, has a requirement that not only do you need to attend multiple events, you need to attend multiple events over 2 different months in the 3-month season. So that avoids the scenario I just described, where you show up for the last 2 weeks of the season, go to 3 events, and you get ranked. In Washington, if you do that, you won't be ranked because you didn't attend things over 2 different calendar months. And so it forces you to be active throughout the season, and they have short enough seasons, so that's a pretty reasonable requirement. So that's another example of how a region might approach making their PA. So now we figured out how people are considered active, and we've set kind of the cutoff criteria, which is you need to have at least beaten someone who's ranked, or otherwise get yourself considered eligible for PR. It might maybe because you did great out of region, maybe because you did well in region. You need to have something that makes us as the people putting together this data say, hey, we should pay attention to that guy. They might make PR. And then from there, you kind of internally, and this isn't something you can really quantify, but you get a sense of where you want to start cutting off even the people who are eligible for PR. For example, so a lot of regions have a set number of players that they rank every season. In Washington, they always rank 10 people. It doesn't matter how many people were good enough to get on their data sheet or had PR wins, they rank 10 people every season, that's it. PM rank does 50 people every year. We don't care how many people go to majors, how many people are considered active. We are going to rank 50 people until PM doesn't have 50 people to rank. That's just how we do it. SoCal, on the other hand, ranks based on what we consider to be where there's a drop off. So we don't have a hard and fast number. We just go until, if you look back at this, we just go until we kind of feel like people are not worth ranking anymore. So in this case, you can see we went to 8 people. We went until Severe was the last posted on OPR. I don't think he was actually. I think he was 6th. But we ranked these 8 people, and if you look at their win records, that kind of makes sense. Severe is at the bottom here. He has a 38% win rate against people who were like PR contenders, whereas like Frequency had a 13%, or NA had a 20%. And so those were people who were considered active and were PR contenders, but didn't get ranked because they just didn't have good enough win percents to really be considered on par with the people who were otherwise being considered to get ranked. And so doing that method, on the one hand, means that you're not ranking people just to meet a number, or if you have 11 people who are really good and all really close to each other, no one's getting shorted because you just happen to be the 11th and they always rank 10 people. SoCal just goes until we feel like we've ranked the people who deserve to be ranked that season. But it also means we have really wacky numbers. We consecutively had PRs that went from 20 people to 17 to 12 to 8, I think back to 10. So we jump all over the place numbers-wise, and it looks a little bit weird. But that's the price we pay for ranking the number of people that we feel deserve to get ranked. So that's kind of how different regions approach it. You can set a number, you can just go until your panel feels like you've hit the point where you should stop ranking people. It depends on how you and your team choose to do it. But that's what I mean by identifying the PR candidates, which is people who are eligible and have good wins, and also where you think you want to start cutting people off, whether that's a hard number or just we're going to go until there's a gap. The next step, and this sounds obvious, look at the actual data. And what I mean by that is whether it's PM rank, where you're looking at an entire year's worth of data across the entire project and community, or you're just ranking 4 months or 3 months worth of data for your local scene, it doesn't matter how much you think you've paid attention over that ranking season. You don't know all the sets that happened, and you certainly don't have an accurate perception of how good people actually were. This might be because you're friends with people and you want to think that they're better than they are. It could be because you just genuinely didn't know an upset happened or you forgot about it. But you need to look at the data before you actually start ordering people and trying to create any semblance of a ranking where you put people in order based on how good they were throughout that time period. A great example of this is we had someone in PM 2019 who will remain unnamed, but was on the panel. And when we did our first ballot, the PM process is we do a ballot. Everyone submits their individual ranking for 2019 or for whatever year it is, and then they all get published with. We take the names off, but you can see where everyone got placed, and you can see kind of who stood out for having weird takes. And everyone else is put in Switch in 2019, who's a very good player, but had kind of a rough year, around like the 6 to 8 or 9 range. He was like clearly top 10, but also not really in contention for top 5. And there was one person who put Switch second. And it was very clear when someone asked him, why did you do that? And the response was, I just thought Switch was really good. And the giveaway there is, they thought Switch was really good. They didn't look at the data for 2019. They didn't go into, let's go back to bracket for a second. Oops. They didn't go into the PM rank data and type in Switch. and pull up how he actually did, they went on their gut feeling of like, I know that Switch has been a top player for a long time, and as a result, I know I've seen him win events like Smash Camp and SG Monthlies, and so I know that he's good, and I'm going to rank him highly as a result. The problem with doing that is that you miss things. Even for someone like me, who's been probably knows more about PM data than anyone else in the world, I miss things. Every year, I like to do when I start the PM rank process. Before we look at the data, before I submit a ballot, I make a list of all the potential candidates just off my gut feeling. This is how good I think people were in 2019. And then after I've done my ballot, where I've looked at the data and really thought through where I think people deserve to be, and gone through the whole process that we're going to talk about, like putting together a competent ranking, I go back and look at that initial gut feeling list, and it's always laughably wrong. And that's someone who pays a lot of attention to the PM scene and the results that are taking place. So no matter if you're working on PM rank or another like scene wide ranking, or even just something smaller scale where you've been to every event for that local, you still need to go back and actually look at the data before you start making the ranking. Is the point, because your gut feeling is not guaranteed to be right and often won't be. And it's important that you, as the person who's making that ranking, do your best to do a good job of capturing what actually happened rather than just how you feel about what happened. Similar to that, and kind of leading into it, there are two other things that are really important in addition to just looking at the data. One is checking your bias. It doesn't matter whether you know all of the people involved or whether you are even someone who, a lot of the time you'll have panelists who are eligible to be ranked on that ranking. Those people are inherently biased, whether it's because they want to be ranked highly, they have friends that they want to rank highly, or just because they've played people and they go, oh, this person's really good, they always beat me. People have those instinctual biases because everyone who's involved with making a ranking is probably involved in the scene in other capacities. We're not talking about anonymized players where you don't get to see who they are. We all have reactions when you ask someone, what do you think about Switch? And that goes into how you rank him. Likewise, you just might miss things. And so that's why it's important to not only be conscious of who you think highly or poorly of and make sure that that's not impacting your eventual ballot. You also want to have other people looking at what you're doing and letting you know if something that you are, if where you put someone is weird or off, or if they disagree with it so that you can talk it through. Because sometimes you might just be missing something or not taking into account a different perspective about why that person should be ranked where they are or aren't, and maybe your opinion might be wrong. And so the more people you have looking at that, the more different perspectives you have that eventually balance out to something that gets close to an objective ranking. Even for a project where you've looked at all the data 100 times, you can still miss something. Even for the tiny projects I did, like 3.6 rank, where I put together a ranking over 4 years of the best players for all of the competitive Project M3.6. I did all that by myself, but I still had two other people, Pikmon and Serb, go through and look at my data, look at who I was considering for the ranking, and then look at the actual ranking I came up with to let me know if there was anything in it that was like, hey, this is really whack, you should maybe reconsider this, or ask me questions about why is that person there, like explain your logic to me, and then by talking through it, I can kind of see whether I still stand by it. Having other people to talk to and consider all of the ranking stuff, it just makes the process not only easier but also more accurate. So it's a very useful tool to have, is to check your biases and make sure you have other people who are checking your work and that you can talk to about the ranking process. Hey Nick, how's it going? Talking about ranking stuff and PM Rank 2019 mostly. Um, I just went over. I will not name names, but if you remember the ballot for round one last year that had Switch at second, and then we were all kind of like, oh, hey, what the fuck is that? I was using that as my example of like, this is why we look at the data and don't just go based on like our gut feelings about people. Um, but yeah, so pretty much always, no matter what project it is, no matter the scale, you want to make sure you have as many people as you can check your work. You want to go back and check your own work and make sure that you're like really thinking critically about what you're doing. Because again, like I said at the beginning, people don't play Smash, especially PM, for like money. But they're not doing this because it's profitable. It's not going to become a career for anyone. We're doing it in part because we like the game, and in part because we like being recognized for the skill and the effort that we've put in. And so when people get ranked, they want it to be accurate. They want it to represent the work that they've put in. And if you're making content or ranking, you're kind of obligated to really do a good job. Put in the work, make sure that you're ranking people accurately because they deserve it after showing up and competing in this game. Yeah, it's also that's a Yubo in chat just made a great point, which is that's why if you just look at a local PR, sometimes it's gonna look really weird because you have your gut feeling of like I know generally the good players in that region. Then you look at the PR and you might be like, why the fuck is that guy number one? But the answer is at locals, maybe that guy is beating all the other people. For example, in SoCal, I was number two. I had barely been ranked the season before that. That was my second PR ever, and I was being ranked above Sneeze, who had been a top player since 2016. But if you went back and looked at how I did that season, it kind of made sense. But everyone who didn't actually look at the PR data was like, what the fuck? Sneeze is really good, and I've barely heard of Saber. Um, Likewise, Massachusetts had Bees at number one on their PR. Massachusetts has like 6 top 50 players. Bees has never made PM rank. Bees also beat everyone in the region, so he got number one. So if you have the data and you look at it, a lot of the time you're going to end up with a different result than the people going on their gut feeling, and that's why you shouldn't care about the gut feeling. Um, Also, going on the gut feeling thing, I also want to add in here. This is something I like to tell PM rank people pretty frequently. Your placement at an event does not equal how you did. I'm going to repeat that again. Your placement does not equal your performance. You can go to an event and you can go to a major and you can get 25th losing to the people who end up getting first and second. That's not a joke. That's happened at 2 different PM majors that I know of. Or you could go and you could get like 9th, beating no one who's top 50 because you just happen to have a good bracket. Those are both fully plausible scenarios that can happen at the exact same tournament. It's impressive that guy got 9th, but if you look at who he beat, that doesn't necessarily mean he's a top 50 caliber player, even if they outplaced people who were top 50 caliber players who lost to, for example, the first and second best players in the world. Yep. That's a common, that often happens when people are losers really early. Great example is, we're going to pull up, if I can find it, the Rewired 2016 bracket. Where is it? At Rewired 2016, I believe it was Dill, got 25th. He lost to Thunders and Winners, who was the first seed of the tournament. First seed of the tournament. Dill loses to Thunders 2-0. And it's like, okay, you lose to Thunders, you go to losers, surely, you'll do great. Except, the second seed got upset super early. So let's go down and look at how Dill did in losers. He beat Carmaster, beat Plum Orchid, 2 solid wins, and then he lost to Sosa, who proceeds to make this very long losers run, all the way to get second. Dill got 25th place at Rewired 2016 to Thunders, Ryan, and Sosa. Him getting 25th place does not necessarily mean that he did poorly at that event. It means he had the worst bracket luck imaginable. Oh fuck. My bad, I didn't have this. I still had the outline open. Imagine I was scrolling through this. Dill loses to Thunders. Sosa gets upset. Go all the way down to losers. Dill beats some people who are not top 50. Loses to Sosa. Sosa makes the losers run because of course he does. TLDR, Dill got 25th to Thunders and Sosa. Sucks to be him. But if you only look at how people did, let's just go back up here. Thunders, Sosa, Els, Jose V, Boringman. You're looking at these guys and you're like, wow, these guys did really well. And then you scroll all the way down. You click Show More. You scroll down. You click Show Full Results because it doesn't go far enough. And all of a sudden you see Dill. He got 17th. I lied. And you're like, wow, Dill didn't do that well. But he lost to the 2 best players in the room. He just had a bad bracket. That's what I mean when I say your placement does not equal your skill or even your result at that event. Um, so yeah, that's another thing that I think is really important for people to keep in mind, and is one of the most common. I don't want to call it mistakes, but misconceptions when people first start getting involved with making rankings. Is they get really excited over how someone plays. They made top 8 at this major. How could they not be ranked? Let's call it top 20. And you ask them who did they beat to make top 8, and the answer is a bunch of people who pulled upsets and then otherwise sucked at every other event that year. And it's like, yeah, then that kind of makes sense why they're not getting auto ranked top 20 for making top 8 in the major, because that top 8 might not mean what you think it means. It's not downplaying the skill of the person who made top 8. It's just looking at everything in context. Every placement, every result in Smash has context. Who did they beat? Who did they lose to? How did they perform at other events that year? How did their seeding impact their placement? Those are all things that impact the number next to their name. In this case, Dill getting 17th. There's a lot more that goes into it than just Dill got 17th, he didn't do well. Okay, next point, back to the outline. So we've looked at the data, we've talked about having a panel and why it's important to pay attention to your biases. Now let's talk about actually making a PR. So for this, we're going to use the SoCal PR data. SoCal PR data. That's a great example. Is all the time you'll have people who just they get really far in bracket by beating people who beat people. Alternatively, so you'll have that, and sometimes they won't even end up doing well, like beating anyone impressive. For example, Low Tier City 7 was one of the most stacked events of 2019. Pirates got 9th. There were a bunch of top 50 players who didn't make top 16. I got 25th. Clearly that means that Pirates should be like a top 50 caliber player, right? He got 9th, beating exclusively people who have never been remotely close to top 50. But those people beat people who were solid, and then he beat them, which is impressive. But it doesn't really mean that him outplacing a bunch of top players means that he's a top player. Also, no matter what your PR is, Serb should be number 1 because he beat Switch that one time, and Switch is probably beating your favorite player, unless your favorite player is Thomas, in which case get fucked. Moving on. How do we actually go about? So we have all this data, we have a panel, we've looked at it. What do we do with that information? The answer is you start trying to put people in some sort of an order that makes sense. So let's go back to that SoCal PR data that I showed you earlier. Here you can see we've ordered people by where they were ranked on previous PRs. So you've got Nez, Sneeze, me, a couple of inactive players like Blood, and then you've got Fracture, Tauntaun, etc. Unranked players, and then people who went to like 2 events but were still considered because they had solid wins and they're worth caring about. They're still good players. They just kind of screwed around that season, and so they were unlikely to make PR, and they ended up at the bottom. What you can do is you kind of look at this and you go, okay, Nez beat damn near everyone. He lost once to Fracture, and he had a 1-2 record with Sneeze. That's the only person he had a negative record on. He was 22-3 against everyone else in SoCal. Nez is probably going to be number 1 that season, huh? So we can write down. Number 1, Nez. Now let's look at who would go after Nez. There's kind of 3 main people that you would want to look at, which are the 3 other people, if you go over here, that have positive win-loss records against the rest of the PR, which are Sneeze, Saber, and Blood. Of those, let's look at them. Sneeze is a positive on Nez, which is great. Negative on both Saber and Blood, and then beats the rest of the PR no problem. He doesn't have a whole lot of data. He's only played 12 sets, but he does have a pretty solid win record against the lower PR and has a winning record on Nez. Saber gets the shit kicked out of him by Nez, 0-5, but he beats literally everyone else. He has a 19-7 record. 5 of those 7 are Nez. But overall, great record. If you care about him beating everyone else more than you care about his ability to beat Nez, Saber's second. Realistically, he's probably a little bit higher than Sneeze, but they're reasonably comparable. Let's look at Blub. Blub has also not beaten Nez, loses to Saber, has beaten Sneeze. He also has a loss to someone who is not going to get ranked, which is Teals, and a lower PR loss to Tauntaun. This means that, combined with the fact that he's the same win-loss record as Sneeze, with worse losses and less impressive wins, given that he hasn't beaten Nez, who is probably going to be number one this season, Blub is probably worse this season than Sneeze and Saber. So we can say that Blub is probably fourth. And between him is 2, 3. So for now, we're just kind of grouping people. Like, we have this top 4, which is Nez, Sneeze, Saber, and Blub. We can say Nez is number 1, Blub is number 4. Those are pretty clear. And then Sneeze and Saber are probably 2 and 3 in some order. And that's all we really need for now. And then we can look at the other people. We've got all these players who are active and could be considered for PR. They all have losing records against the PR on average, largely because they just lose to all the people who are in the top 4. But they still have valuable data that should be considered, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they shouldn't get ranked because they can't beat the top 4. So if we look at that, we can then go to kind of find our next tier, which is Fracture, Tauntaun, and Severe. Those are the 3 players where they all have at minimum a 20% win rate. Fracture actually has beaten 12 wins over PR contenders, including wins over Tauntaun, Severe, and then inactive players like Elshumo and Swift, who were top 50 level players, and a 43% win rate. Fracture definitely should get ranked. He goes in the tier that's kind of below this top 4. Let's look at Severe. Severe has a 38% win rate, mostly over low PR contenders. He has a win on Fracture, though a mostly negative record. He has a win on Dumb Shiny, who's a former PR player who kind of screwed around that season, but again, still has solid wins. And he's always beaten Frequency, who has a win on Fracture. It is kind of on this sheet, but is unlikely to actually make the PR. So Severe is probably going to get ranked. He hasn't beaten nearly as many people, but he has solid wins. And a reasonably good head-to-head record based on the fact that he consistently beats the people at the bottom end of this list, namely 3-0 on Frequency. So he's probably going to end up below Fracture, but Severe's probably going to get ranked. I skipped Tauntaun because I just forgot about him. Hi, Moto. Yeah, you missed me bitching about PM Rank 2019, but I'll get back to it. Don't worry. Tauntaun, same deal. Very little data. Similar to Sneeze, where Sneeze only had 12 sets, and it was, Tauntaun only has 5. He's played 5 people total, and he's beaten one of them. But he hasn't lost anyone that bad. He lost to 3 people who definitely didn't get ranked, 2 in the top 4, and then Fracture. He has 1 loss to NA, who's one of those lower PR contenders, kind of like Frequency, and he has a win on Blub, who's top 4. Based on that, he's maybe worth ranking. It's kind of hard to tell. He goes in kind of the Severe category. Okay, so now let's look at this again. So after looking at a few more people, Fracture is kind of clearly above Severe and Tauntaun. He does relatively well against most of the people in SoCal. He has wins against people who are in the top 4. That's enough for him to get number 5. I hope he got 5. I actually have no idea. I think he got 5. Then we've got... Yeah, he did. Then Severe and Tauntaun are another kind of cluster. Here, let me add the number just so we can keep track of all this. I'm not going to go over why, but Jostin is also in contention for this tier. If you go and look at his data, he has a 40% win rate, has played at least enough sets to get ranked, and pretty much just loses to like the top 5, which is Saber, Blub, and Fracture, who are 2 either 2 or 3, 4, and 5 respectively, and then beats the people who are like the kind of borderline contenders, which are like Frequency and NA. So that's enough to get Justin in contention along with players like Severe and Tauntaun. That rounds out kind of our 8. And then we have kind of a clear drop off after that. You've got Frequency and NA who have like one solid win apiece. NA's beaten Tauntaun once. He's at the already, kind of on the borderline of making PR. So beating him is quite enough to really get you on. Same deal with Frequency, who has a 1-1 record with Fracture, but otherwise loses to everyone else, including the other PR contenders like Severe and NA. So that's where we find that drop off we talked about earlier. We found a point where people are more or less losing to everyone else who's in contention for PR at a point where we go, okay, their wins don't balance out the amount and the number of losses that they have. As well as if you go over and you look at this tab, this is the noteworthy wins and losses for people that like aren't on this sheet. That might mean people who are not good enough to be considered PR contenders, so they're like not good and not active enough to be on this list of 11 players who could plausibly make the SoCal PR this season. Well, it could be that they traveled out of region and fought these people. So you can see, for example, Nez went out of region, and he fought Casino Wolf and Aeon and I Love Bagels in an Arizona regional. So that data shows up under noteworthy out of region. But it's still worth caring about. That's also another reason why Nez is number 1. Is he beat Casino Wolf and did relatively well against out of region people. The out of region stuff is messy and oftentimes gets used as a tiebreaker. And so that was one of the arguments that really went into this specific ranking. Is if we go and we look at, let's take this cluster here. 2 and 3 is still undecided. Sneeze and Saber have reasonably comparable data. Saber does better against everyone else, including Sneeze, but he can't beat Nez. While Sneeze can beat Nez, but he loses to Saber and loses to Blub, and has a worse overall win record, in addition to being a lot less active. But on the other hand, let's look at those out-of-region wins. Saber has beaten Grime and Studebaker Hawk, who are like mid-level PR players in Texas. Sneeze goes out-of-region. He beats Alton and Yink, who are similarly skilled like mid-level PR players. Takes a set off Casino Wolf, and beats I Love Bagels twice. He's a consistent top 50 player. That's really good. The question is, do those out-of-region wins and that out-of-region performance outweigh how he does against people in SoCal? Is that enough to make up for the fact that he's losing to Saber and losing to Blub, and overall has a worse win percent? In this case, the PR talked about it, or the PR panel talked about it, and the decision was no. So what we ended up with was Saber at second, Sneeze at third, and everyone else in SoCal very, very confused. But there's a logic to it. If you go based on how people did at locals in this season, Saber performed better against everyone who wasn't Nezuji, and Nezuji was number 1 in the region. So if you're ranking based on who should be ranked after Nezuji, it made sense to rank the guy who beats everyone but Nezuji. So that was the logic. But if we had cared more about those out-of-region wins, Sneeze was fairly close to being ranked above Saber. Maybe if those wins against I Love Bagels and Casino Wolf, Alton, and Yink had been prioritized a little more, maybe he could have moved up. Maybe he would have been second because we cared about his ability to not only beat Nez, but also beat those out-of-region players. It depends on what you and your panel prioritize. I'm not going to go through this same process for explaining how we ended up with the 6 through 8 that was Severe, Tauntaun, and Jostin. I think they were actually ranked in exactly that order, Severe and then Tauntaun and then Jostin, but I don't really remember. But walking you through that example of how we kind of cluster people and we say this is where there's a skill gap. You have Nez way up at the top, and then you've got Saber, Sneeze, and Blub, and then if you look at it a little closer, you can kind of tell that, like, okay, Blub is probably worse than the other two. So Blub is 4, and then after Blub is Fracture. And Fracture is clearly worse than everyone above him, but he's also pretty clearly better than everyone below him. So Fracture is 5. And then we have a few people who, again, kind of fall into this group where they're close enough to each other that you can make the argument any one of them should be higher than the others. And so you have to go back and look at those clusters. myself, Saber and Sneeze, Severe, Tauntaun, and Justin, and really think about um, what you actually care about in a ranking. Because contrary to chat has prompted me with an excellent question, a ranking is not a ranking of the best players in the region. It is a ranking of the people who performed the best within the parameters of that PR season, who attended and were considered active at events, who picked up wins over other qualifying and top level players, and performed well enough according to the criteria that the panel sets. Often that means beating people who are also on the PR. If you beat people who are not on the PR, that could be really valuable. It could be very impressive. Usually it will not be enough to save your PR placement if you sucked against everyone else in the region. And I'm not saying, to be clear, that's not what happened with Sneeze. Sneeze did well against everyone else in the region, which is why he was third. But if you have someone who's completely sandbagging at locals, but they go out of region and they get like 2 top 50 wins, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to get placed ranked higher than they did in region just because we know they're good and we knew they were sandbagging. They're going to get ranked how they performed because we're ranking people based on their performance, not a gut feeling about how good they are, which goes back to being able to check our biases. All we care about here is the data. In a perfect world, you should be able to come up with the exact same ranking if I remove all of these names and I title them Player A, Player B, Player C, and without the names, without knowing what tournament these things happened at, you should be able to look at these results in this head-to-head chart and come up with the same ranking because you have a consistent logic that has nothing to do with how good you think those players are or how important you think their wins are. The PR serves as a picture in time. It's you saying, for these 4 months, at these events, the events that we considered important, which were these locals that had these players in attendance, this is the list of our best play of the players who performed the best at those events in that time period. It's not saying that Nez will forever be better than Sneeze or Saber or Glove. It's saying that over those 4 months, he has quantifiably performed better at those events. And as a result, for that time period, he was the best player in the region. That's all a ranking is. It's not a value judgment of how good a player is. It's not about whether you think that player will always be better. It's just the aggregate of their results over a period of time. Let's go back to the outline for a minute. So we've covered the next 2 spots pretty much back to back. We've talked about ordering players, which is what we did by taking our top 4, Nez, Sneeze, Saber, and Blub, and then Fracture, who kind of is by himself, and then you've got Severe and Tauntaun and Justin. Those are 3 groupings of players who are more or less comparable to each other and could arguably be above or below each other. Then you can define it a little bit more by looking at those individual people, comparing Saber to Sneeze, comparing Severe to Tauntaun to Justin, and looking at did those people perform better against other people who were better than them, at their level, worse than them, were they consistent, did they have really good wins at the top level but just didn't do well against other people who were around or below their skill level, and figuring out what the pros and cons are that would justify ranking any of them above the others. For that example I gave with Saber and Sneeze, that might be you would rank Sneeze higher if you care about his ability to beat Nezuji and his performance out of region. If you care about performance in region, rewarding high attendance, and rewarding consistent wins over everyone else in the region, you would rank Saber higher. And so there's not necessarily an argument over which one is better. It's about which one you care about. Which pros and which cons you think are important when evaluating those 2 players directly compared to each other. And that's how you figure out those close-ish situations with 2 people who are not obviously better or worse than each other. And then eventually you end up with a list. So in this case, we ended up with a list. Let me go back. That was... I'm doing this from memory. I really hope I got it right. So this was the SoCal Spring 2019 Power Rankings. Nezuji, Saber, Sneeze, Blub, Fracture, Severe, Tauntaun, and Justin. We had a team of about 5 people that all looked at this spreadsheet and gave input on who we think is who of these players and Justin, the 8 that we ended up with. Um, who of these players should be ranked higher or lower than each other? If they disagreed with the orderings, the groupings that I just talked about, which is what we ended up agreeing upon, like maybe some people thought that Fracture was comparable to or even better than Blood, and then we would need to have that conversation. Are those two players, how do they compare? How do they stack up to each other? Or if they have different values about how you might compare Saber and Sneeze. I think out of region is more important. I think local attendance is more important. Then people have to talk that out and come to a decision on how you eventually think those two players should be ordered compared to each other. And that can be done via common consensus, which is often the case for the local PR panel. It might be 3 to 5 people who just sit down and talk it out until they all agree that this is the ranking. Or it might be like PM rank, where you all submit your own ballot, ordering players, and then the average of that is what you end up with as the final result. Or more specifically, PM rank does the average minus the outliers. We usually have about 20 panelists, and people tend to have some whack opinions every now and then. So we remove the highest and the lowest outcome for each contender, basically, to get closer to the real average without someone really skewing things because they had a whack take. But again, the decision process depends on your team and how big it is and how much you tend to disagree. But eventually, you'll end up with something like this. You'll end up with a list of these are the players who we ranked. We think that these 8 players are the ones who stand out above everyone else. In this order, these are the best players over this time period at these events. So then what do? It's great that you have a list, but you need to do something with it. You need to actually go ahead and not just finalize the data, but you need to put it somewhere. You want people to know about it. Because again, the point of making a ranking isn't just to be able to quantify who did well. It's that people are playing this game for pride. And they want to get recognized for performing well, and they want to have something they can compare themselves to and give themselves a goal, whether it's getting ranked higher than they were the season before, going number 1, staying at number 1, just staying on the PR. If you're not PR yet, your goal might just be to make the PR. And so it has to be out there for all of these goals to be made and kept. Someone has to be able to see this and take away information from it. And so that means that you have to put it out there. There are usually a couple ways that people like to go about doing this. Sorry, my throat's dry. There are a few ways you can go about doing this. And the main one is you just post a graphic. SoCal every season, our Facebook group just has a graphic. How do I put this one back up? This was the graphic for Winter 2019 PR. You can see again we had 8 players, and each one is represented in order. We've got Sneeze, Nez, Gumshiny, etc. You can see who they played. This was the season for which they were active, and that gets posted and everyone can see it. And when you go to SoCal Project M, let me just open it. The first thing you see is that banner up at the top. And so every time you open that page, you're going to see you're going to see that rank. It's your motivation, it's your reward for getting ranked. It's the first thing you see. But you don't just have to post a picture. And I'll get into it in a minute, but if you don't know how to make a picture or a graphic, you don't necessarily need to do it yourself. There are people in the scene who are really awesome about doing this stuff and helping scenes get graphics made so that they can recognize their players. People like Motobug and Q-Tip are people that are great resources and you can reach out and they might be able to help you if they have free time. If you can't find someone or you don't know someone who can make graphics, you can also just kind of post on social media, on Discord or Twitter. And if you at pretty much any notable community leader, they're happy to signal boost it. If you tweet, I need someone to help me make a PR graphic, and you at Saber on Twitter, I will signal boost it. And I'll say, hey, someone help this guy show off his region's PR. But you don't just have to stop with doing a graphic. Maybe you want to explain why people got those rankings. You want to walk people through the logic of Sneeze being number 1 on this PR and Nazoji being 2nd, as opposed to the year before where Nazoji was 1 and Sneeze was 3. That's when we get into something like PM Rank 2019 or every PM Rank, which we post articles about our players. We reveal 50 players every year, and we do them broken out over, I think, 7 different articles, and we write about every single one. Combe was ranked top 50 in 2019. Look at Combe. That dude's so hot. But we don't just post a graphic and go, yeah, Combe's 50, good for him. We also write about it. We talk about Combe and who he is, and who he beat, and what he did, and we explain what went into Combe becoming the 50th best player in the world in 2019. Doing that does two things. One, it's another reward for Combe. Not only does he get this graphic and the reward of like knowing that he's the 50th best player in the world, he gets that validation, but it also shows everyone else who might be looking at this and they didn't spend months going through the PM Rank 2019 bracket league, which has 1,000 players and like several thousand sets. You can just read this and you can go, oh hey, this says that Combe lost at LSDX and O'Reilly, and then he beat Kumatora, he beat Anthony, he picked up a win over Cloudburst at Smash and Splash 5, and you can read this and you can kind of see the logic for why Combe is top 50. These are who he beat, this is who he beat, this is who he lost to. This resume was impressive enough to get him 50th in the world. And so it kind of explains the logic for someone who is just looking at the ranking without knowing what went into it. So it solves that problem of what we talked about earlier, where if you don't know people based on anything other than your kind of background knowledge about them, you might look at a PR and be like, why the fuck is that guy there? If there's a whole article underneath it explaining why the fuck that guy is there, it's a bit harder to ask that question, because that logic is being put right in front of you. You don't necessarily have to agree with it, but it's an explanation right up front of why that player is ranked where they were. I'm not talking about Anthony's other tags. I'm just grateful I didn't have to commentate for him at AFL. Yeah, we talked about B's number 1 that season. We talked about the season I was number 2 in SoCal, and everyone was upset except the people who actually paid attention. We talked about, you missed it, but we talked about the panelist who will remain unnamed that put Switch at second on the first PM Rank 2019 ballot, and then we made him look at the data, and he's like, oh yes, which was not number 2 in the world that year. People's gut feelings do not mean accuracy when it comes to ranking. As I've said so many times in this stream, the data means who's actually deserves to get ranked and where. And that means that the public often needs an additional explanation than just a picture as to why someone got ranked there. So these articles are something that the PM Rank team does every year. We do 50 of them. They get longer as we go because players attend more and we have more narratives and storylines to talk about. But we put in work to make sure that people can easily understand the reasons that they got ranked and the storylines that they're involved in. And it makes reading these rankings more than just a list of 50 names. It makes the whole thing more exciting. But you could go even further than that. You could also do something like a PR video. So, for example, for PM Rank 2019, we had a video where you could go and we had PM Rank 2019. And every player, you can see down at the bottom, in addition to this ad, Combe is number 50. Here's Combe being sick at the game. Anthony was 49. Here's Anthony comboing the hell out of somebody. And so you get a sense not only of, like, who these players beat on paper, but you also get to watch them being good. And so it's something that is validation for the players, and it's also is something cool for the rest of the scene to watch and talk about and give them another incentive to try and get ranked next year. Not only do I want to be top 50 in the world, I want to be in this sick video that got 12,000 views. And so it's all about, again, you're giving people who are active in the scene already an incentive, but you're also creating content that gives everyone else who's not necessarily a contender for PR a reason to care about PR, whether because it's interesting or it's a motivation for them to get ranked next season, and it's more things for people to talk about. And like I said at the beginning of this stream, there are 2 ways to keep your game alive. People need to be talking about it for your game to be alive. People talk about your game either because you're running tournaments or because you're making content for them to talk about. Rankings are one of the easiest ways to make content. Every time you have a tournament, that's data for a ranking. Every few months, if you haven't had a ranking, do a ranking. It's a really easy way for you to have material to get people talking about the game again. Yeah. I'm going to go into it in a different video. I'm going to do a different stream on how to make combo videos because I think I've made more combo videos than anyone else in Smash history at this point. And I'm going to talk about how to make different types of combo videos, including ranking videos, because those are actually a completely different animal from like a traditional combo video. It is a little bit harder because it means that you're not just showing off like, oh, this is who I think is really cool. You might get a player that you're like, this dude is ranked, but he's not very cool. We're going to go through and find the coolest looking 2-hit combo I can find in 30 seconds. And that's going to be that dude's clip, which is a whole different set of challenges. Shoutouts to Quaff and Dirtboy, who 2 years in a row had their clips found in 20 seconds by me from the same set. But yeah, so if we come back to this outline, I think over the last hour, I've gone through not only why rankings are important, but how you make them and the process of making a ranking that is well thought out and actually worth caring about. You go through and you identify these are the players we care about, these are the events we care about, and from those 2 pieces of data, you can figure out kind of who should actually be considered eligible for that PR based on who they beat, who they lost to, and you can start going through the process of grouping players into general categories based on their skill and their results, going through individual groupings and ordering them one by one, and then eventually coming up with a final result that you can publish, whether that's in a graphic or a video or an article, and then you have a ranking.